there are some things that we advocate as Christians that will only have an earthly reward, only have an earthly gain, only have an earthly perspective. But doesn't mean that it's not important. So I use that example as racial equality.
And I'm back. Thanks so much for checking out Common Grounds, the podcast where we have earnest conversations with pastors and ministry leaders in the Christian church. I'm your host, Andrew Montoya. So after taking somewhat of a long hiatus from doing Common Grounds, I tried, at the start of the pandemic, I tried to do some Zoom calls, and while I love the people that I was talking to over the Zoom calls, it doesn't feel the same, doesn't have the same feeling, but I'm in my new home studio, and I should be able to produce even more podcasts and more content, original content that I'm really excited to start getting into. If you'd like to support the podcast, like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Definitely ring the bell so you get notifications anytime I am uploading a new episode. Check out the Facebook page also where I upload clips. And if you'd really like to support the podcast, you can purchase one of my Common Ground mugs at the link below. All right, today my guest is Frank Gregoire, lead pastor at We Are Dream Church. In this episode of Common Grounds, we're going to talk about race, religion, journalism, fruit concentrate, Power Rangers and Glorious Bastards, No Country for Old, so many things. We're going to talk about a lot. And even though we talk about so much, I feel like we only just reached the tip of the iceberg, and I definitely want to have Frank back on to delve deeper into a few topics. With all that being said, let's roll the intro.
The blessings came in waves and could be felt for days. Oh, how my bones still shake at your name.
All right, man. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Absolutely.
I'm excited. This is the first one doing in my new home studio.
I like it.
Finally, it's been a long time coming. But yeah, I was telling you, so I was going to set up my own little podcast studio in my old office in my townhome at where we were at the time. I need to intercut like all the different scenes that I've done, like my videos and stuff for the podcast.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. Absolutely.
But finally here, and I'm pretty sure I'll be here for at least a year.
Awesome.
Until another baby kicks me out or something.
I can understand.
We're talking about turning the garage into mine and her office space.
Oh, cool.
Mine and my wife's office space. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce you to my wife.
That's all right.
We'll do that after.
We'll get to that after. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So we can jump right into it, I guess, Frank.
Awesome.
So kind of introduce yourself and your background.
Well, my name is Frank Gregoire. Let's see here. I grew up in the Dayton, Texas area for most of my life. You know, I kind of did a little stint in Baytown. Now I'm back in Baytown, but most of my real childhood memories up until of course college age and adult age was in Dayton. So I grew up there, and I grew up just kind of in church and everything like that. So I did the whole parents dragging us to church type thing. And so that was one thing. But, and then as soon as I got out of high school, I started worked a job. It was my first job. Was at a grocery store of all places. I liked it. I liked to learn. I learned the business and everything like that.
What do you mean you learned the business?
Well, so, when you're working at a grocery store, you kind of learn people. And so that's what I say. I learned people more than anything. And so you met different people. And so when I say learn the business,
that'll prep you for ministry.
Absolutely. I mean, it helped me learn people. And I worked the frozen section. And so everybody kind of went through there, whether it's getting frozen pizza or frozen juice of all things. But I know it's crazy, but concentrated juice.
I wanted to like concentrate because it seemed kind of convenient, but I could never get over that that you could tell it was concentrate.
You could tell
kind
it's
of
concentrate. The taste is. I tried it out just to see what the hype was, and it's.
I didn't know there was hype around.
Oh man, it was.
You know what? It was bigger back then, huh?
It was
before everybody was into this organic kind of
stuff. Yeah, absolutely. I remember growing up, there wasn't. As a matter of fact, even in the grocery store that I worked at the time, this is in 2004, there was no organic section.
Yeah,
so
it wasn't.
Organic just kind of, it was like a new thing, and then I can taste the difference. Some people can't.
I can when it comes to eggs.
Eggs, you know what, that's true. I like the fresh eggs off the farm, but I've had organic eggs, and I've had just the whatever been selling to us for years.
They've been selling to us.
You could taste the difference. You're absolutely right. But I enjoyed it. Moved on from there. Started working for my dad. And what really made me decide to get into ministry, this is gonna be a funny story. My dad fired me
from the grocery store.
No, this is from I moved from the grocery store, and I worked for him in the refinery business. And so we went from job to job, and he was my supervisor and everything like that. And I enjoyed working for him. Working with my dad was great. Most of the days that I was off. But when I was there, he was more hard on me. He expected me to do my work and everything. My dad has always been the first one there, the last one to leave, and so he expected me to have that same mentality. And I did the best that I could, but I felt that drawing towards ministry. He could tell it. He could feel it, and I'll never forget when he gave me my walking papers. I almost took offense to it, but he knew that it was time for me to kind of move on to what God really was pushing on my heart. And so from there,
what did that look like at the time?
Man, it was scary. So
well, I mean, like him being able to tell that you were getting into like the realm of full-time ministry.
All right, so how that looked is it's a funny story. So we worked in Channelview. He had a office in Channelview, and he still works at that company. He's still now he's got a little more titles and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But every day for lunch, I would go and drive around the city. And for those who know Channelview, sometimes you just don't drive around certain areas of Channelview, especially if you're on the other side of Channelview, North Shore, Cloverleaf area. Oh. But I drove through there every day.
I went to Bondi and middle school.
Oh, wow.
And they hated playing North Shore. They hated playing North Shore so much.
Yeah, North Shore is my heart's always going to be there, but North Shore, Channelview area is just a rough area. So how that, every day for lunch, I'm driving through the neighborhoods, and I just remember beginning to pray. I was like, man, this is a dark area. This is a dark place. And so I began to pray, and I found myself in the parking lot of the small, back in the neighborhood, could be mistaken as a house church. And I was like, you know what? Let me just pray in the parking lot. So I did that. And one Sunday I went to go and visit that church, and unbeknownst to me, that church actually was the church of two pastors that I met 4 years earlier, at what they call an AMT training that the Assembly of Gods put on for ministers who are getting their credentials and everything like that. So I went there about almost 4 years prior at another church. I met those two pastors. I had no idea that was their church. I had no idea. Like at the time, they had changed the name. So so to be fair, they had changed the name, and so I did not know that was the name that they had changed it to or anything like that. But when I saw them, we immediately connected. We immediately built a connection there. And then over the course of time, I was telling my dad about this, and he could see the writing on the wall. It got to the point where I was asking for Wednesdays off earlier. So where we would normally get off at 5 or 6, I wanted to go home and get dressed so I could be to church around that time, and everything like that. And so I started visiting that church more. And I think the writing on the wall was when my dad asked me if I was willing to go out of town for a job. And I said, yeah, let me think about it. And that was the kind of the straw, because I ended up going on the job, and everything like that. But I remember coming back, he just, that's when he gave me my walking papers. And it, I thought it would have hurt him to do it, but he kind of had a smile on his face and everything like that. But God really just opened the door as soon as that happened for me to jump into ministry.
Wow. So that you mentioned that there's a YouTube channel I love to watch. It's called Movies Explained For, MEF, and he was doing a Q&A. I love the channel. It's hilarious. But he was doing a Q&A, and he was talking about they asked him, like, how did he start doing this channel? And he was talking about how he had like 3 other failed YouTube channels that he tried to start. Wow. And at that point, he was living with his mom, and at that point, he gave up. And he went to go find a job. And whenever he came back with a job one day, his mom was like super distraught and disappointed because he gave up on what he really wanted to do, which was interesting. And then she actually helped him. Long story short, she actually ended up helping him figure out how to do the successful YouTube channel that he started.
That's pretty cool.
So it's pretty cool. I like those stories whenever parents really like give that extra boot to really get someone doing what they want to do.
Definitely, it's important, especially my dad is. He's all my mom. She's she's always that. I want my kids in the nest. I want my kids doing life with me. Of course, that's just how some moms are. But my dad, he's always kind of been like, okay, it's time for you to leave the nest. Do what you're called to do and everything like that. And so that was pretty cool. He looking back at it now, I'm like, man, he played a big part and to where I'm at today. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a big thing, and we'll kind of come back to that. I suspect, further down the line in our conversation, the role that fathers play,
right.
Which I think is part of it I think has to do with The Simpsons. So it started off. Simpsons started off as a pretty wholesome comedy about a guy with no ambition. But for all of his faults, he loves his family more than anything and would do anything for them.
That's true.
And then it went off the rails completely into absolute buffoonery.
Absolutely.
But so I guess moving on, what did you do first? Start to jump into full-time ministry?
So my first moments of jumping into full-time ministry was kind of like a downer. I'll say that because I was expecting one thing and I was introduced to something totally different.
Such is life.
So and I have we matter of fact, me and a friend of mine, her and her husband are missionaries in Japan. We always tell each other, because we served at the same church. We graduated from the School of Hard Knocks, but so I felt like it was a downer because I grew up in I would like to call it a blue collar church. I grew up in a church where the youth pastor was full time, the worship pastor was full time, the lead pastor is full time. You got it was just a church of full time staff members. Everything seemed kind of. And there was nothing wrong with them. It's just everything seemed kind of cookie cutter. Everything was kind of great, not necessarily knowing what was going on behind the scenes, because we all know sometimes the grass may look green, but it's because they've probably been watering it a long time.
Well, what year was that?
This was in the year of 2008. So my journey,
I was about to say, that's not that long ago, and then I'm like,
yeah,
that was over 10 years ago.
It's over 10 years ago. It's been a while.
Yeah.
So this happened in 2008. And prior to that, so kind of just to give you a little small glimpse, prior to that, I was a youth leader for a friend of mine who was a youth pastor in Dayton. And so I was juggling Channelview, going to visit and just having a heart for it and just wanting to be a part of what they were doing, even though this church was not on anyone's radar but God's. It was like one of those things where whoever showed up on a Sunday morning was ordained by God, like if it was a visitor, because that church it stood off in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a neighborhood. But, I was a youth leader helping a friend out in Dayton, and And I kind of knew I wanted to be in the ministry, but at the time, dealing with the youth at that time, I was like, oh man, I don't know if I want to really necessarily be in. I kind of like being behind the scenes, you know?
Yeah.
I never wanted to be kind of in the forefront. So the youth pastor at the time, if he needed chairs moved, I was his guy. If he needed luggage towed on a youth trip, I was his guy. But, you know, I could tell he was pushing me, him personally, that youth pastor at the time was pushing me to be more than just behind the scenes, to be more than just a body.
How old were you at the time?
At the time, I was only, 19 at the time.
19.
19
okay.
at the time.
Gotcha.
So, he wanted to, he definitely pushed me further. And he was like, man, he said, so he always talked in the future tense. So man, when you're leading your youth group and when you're pastoring a church, you know, this, you can do things this way, or, you know, you find your own way to do it. And so when you're leading, and I was like, man, he's either going to give me the boot or, but he was just preparing me future tense. He always wanted to talk future tense. He said, you know, he always used to teach us that sometimes you can get caught up in the now, that you don't want to move forward. And so he's like, you're going to have great moments, you know, youth trips and youth conventions and stuff like that. He said, but don't get caught up in the now, man, because God has great things as you move forward and as you move on. And so he always talked in the future tense. And so when I sat him down, he already knew in his spirit. He was like, yep, you're leaving. And so he sent me off with his blessing.
Well, was that the way he talked to you, like as in like the future tense, was that something that he did like just with you, or was that kind of just his teaching way?
Well, you know, it's kind of his teaching way. It was just his teaching way, but he particularly poured into me a lot more because, you know, he would drag me to these pastors' breakfast meetings and stuff like that, and he would involve me. And every time, like him and Pastor had a meeting, he would be like, "Hey, me and Pastor had this meeting, and this is what we talked about." And next meeting, Pastor wants you to be in there, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to be in there. And he's like, no, yeah, man, you need to be in there. So when you're leading the youth, you know, and you're leading, and so he particularly, there was like 3 of us. 2 of them were students, and then there was me. But those students, they also went on to just be big vital parts, even in my ministry, in the Channelview area. So yeah, when I get to Channelview, I'm like expecting a full-time position. I left my home church where it was a bunch of full-time pastors, left the church that I was serving at under my friend who was a youth pastor, all full-time staff members and everything like that. But then I get there and it's like, man, well, we can afford to probably give you maybe $20 a week. And I'm sitting there like, what? But I realized it really wasn't. What made me realize that it wasn't about that, because I kind of got thrown into that position because one Sunday, on a Sunday morning, he announced that they felt like they found a youth pastor. And I'm sitting there like, okay, so, well, at this point in time, I'm like, well, maybe I'm called to serve whoever that is. Then that Sunday night for service, they announce it's me. And I'm sitting there like, we never had a meeting.
They never talked to you about it?
They never talked to me about it. I mean, it was kind of cool. But he kind of hinted to me several times, like, and then I've talked to him, was like, I'll be looking short, probably soon. But I guess they felt like the time was then. And they had one youth there, and I remember just like getting in my truck, and I'm like, if I drive and never come back, they can't fault me for that. They cannot fault me for that. But as I'm fixing to back out of that church, I hear knocking on my window, and it's a young girl. And I roll down the window, and I asked her, is everything all right? She says, oh, everything's fine. I just wanted to let you know I'm so happy that you're my youth pastor. Now I got to give this thing another week. But
it would have been really fun if you rolled it down. Here's the thing.
And that I wanted to so bad several times, but It honestly, and it's kind of funny. We'll get to that point here in a little bit. But there was a reason why God sent me to Channelview. And that fulfillment of why I went through what I went through in Channelview with certain students was fulfilled this year at a wedding.
Oh.
So without me going to Channelview and without me serving at a certain church there, building a relationship that lasted, I have a student who literally from that first youth group, he was a little boy. He was probably 7. No, he was probably 8 or 9, somewhere around that area. He's like 22 now. So I watched him grow up, but he's been in and out of trouble. This young man has been in prison. He's kind of gotten in trouble there, but even in prison, he would call me and he said, Pastor Frank, there's not many numbers. I don't even know my parents' number, but I always remembered your number. And I started thinking to myself, well, dude, I can't believe I actually kept the cell phone number for a long time. That was what I was thinking. But to him, it was like, you were always that safety net. And he knew that I wouldn't push him away. He knew that I wasn't there to judge him. I was there to love him. And so he was just like, listen, I really felt like the Lord has spoke to me here in this prison. And I'm sitting there thinking in my mind like, that's what every prisoner says. But he's shown me when he got out. I mean, he's been on the straight and narrow and so push kind of come forward from leaving Channelview to being in Baytown. I was serving at my home church for a little bit. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But there was a student there who I got to be friends with along the way for years before I even got there. But that student from Channelview and that student from Baytown got married. And had I never went to Channelview, had I never accepted an opportunity to work at my home church in Baytown, those two would have never gotten married. Those two would have never met.
Wow.
And so I felt a release. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt a release for the first time because I was always burdened. Mm-hmm. Like, did I do enough? Did I leave enough on the field? Did I do everything I could for those students in Channelview and in Baytown? Because both of them came at an end that I didn't want. God saw it, but they both came to an end that unexpectedly. But that was like I did do everything that I could. Mm-hmm. This was the fulfillment.
Kind of like that confirmation of closure.
And now that when I sleep, I don't worry about if I've done enough, Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what happened with that journey.
Wow. People who aren't like in the church, that might be hard for them, just like with the word release. But I mean, it's really not that complicated because it's just, you do things in your life and then, you have that exact, not even necessarily in ministry, but in other things like, should I have done something differently? Right. Should I have pushed a little bit harder sometimes? But it's a weird feeling whenever you finally have that closure moment, especially in something like ministry. Because I think, if you've been involved in a ministry and it meant something to you, not necessarily if you're just helping somebody out, but if you were involved and it meant something for you and you kind of shared ownership in that, it's a little, not as intense, I would say, but a little bit like the end of Schindler's List when he starts thinking about, in retrospect, he's thinking about all these things he could have done to achieve more. Right. And no, it's great that you were able to get that kind of feeling of closure on that because it's not a good feeling like you've left something undone. No,
it's definitely not. Definitely not.
And especially as part as, like as being a Judeo-Christian believer, it's something that we should be taking seriously.
Absolutely.
In terms of everlasting consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's something that I definitely... we in the beginning, when I was young, I didn't see everything the way that I see now that I'm more mature and everything like that. I always say the older I get, the more conservative I get, on certain thoughts and everything like that. But I'll never forget. I was sitting back like driving one day, even it was just driving in the Channelview area, and I'm like, man, I just drove my whole route because I used to pick students up, bring them to church, preach to them, put them back in the van, drop them back home, then come back to the church, get my vehicle and leave, go home and everything like that. But I remember, man, every one of those students had a story. Mm. And so it meant something to me to know their story. And so I never, once my views changed on how ministry really is, I started actually meeting people. We kind of kicked around his name earlier, and he was just a good friend. He was a good person. Kevin Martin was a good person. But, meeting him, meeting some other guys, just like I started realizing, man, everybody's kind of in the same fight, and everybody, but Kevin, he kind of had that, I know, not only do I know my students, I know their story.
Yeah.
And that's that I picked up. I was like, you know what? I'm not just going to be some youth pastor who is facilitating spaces.
Kevin, as an aside, Kevin kind of taught me something about myself. So he took the core youth group out, the core leadership. He took us to go get pizza one Sunday afternoon after church.
Cool.
And during, about a third of the way in, maybe halfway through, he looks up and he's like, guys, I have something to tell y'all. And it was funny because I remember exactly how I felt at that moment. And this will give you some background to my history in the church. I was like, here we go again. Whatever. We'll see what happens next. And then of course he said, he's going to be leaving the church and they're going to be looking for a new youth pastor. And I was like, yep. Well, easy come, easy go. Cheers. I hope you do great at your next church. And I wasn't even thinking that sarcastically, because of my past experiences, I was kind of sincere. I was like, good on you, man. Go do what you need to do.
All right.
But then, of course, and this is the funny part. He said, "I'm not really leaving, but how you felt whenever I said that, that's how you need to feel whenever kids decide not to come back to the youth group." And I was like,
wow.
Well, no, I'm not going to tell you how I felt when he said that.
Yeah, I'm not going to mention that, but wow.
And so, that was an effective lesson for everybody else, but it also kind of taught me, I was like, man, I've had probably a little bit more of an abnormal experience in the church than a lot of people probably have. Because by that time, so we went to a church we went to Christian Temple for a while.
Okay.
And then my dad got super busy and my mom got super busy. And then I think some stuff that happened at the church, I have no idea. But we kind of stopped. We were out of church. Have at it, man. Have at it. So awesome. We'd stopped going to church for a while. And then this church in Houston called Elam.
Okay.
They would always have I think they called them the power team at the time.
Yeah.
And we went to go see them. They had a tiger there, a white tiger there also, or something some craziness. And we went and
snake pits.
well, my brothers and sisters and I, we really loved their children's church. And so I think my parents started feeling a little bit guilty and obligated. So my mom started taking us, then my dad started going, then my dad eventually got involved teaching the 5th and 6th graders at that church. That was a big old blow up. And then we left, we went to a Baptist church. And then he started getting involved. He started going there to teach, I think to help kickstart the 5th and 6th grade,
right.
to be a children's pastor.
Okay. Cool.
And then some complicated stuff happened there. And he was like, you know what? Fine. You do it. And then so he left and we went to a different church for him to be the children's pastor. And then there was some more complicated business there, and we
Right.
left.
Wow.
And that's actually whenever my brother and I, we started going to Crosby.
Okay, yeah.
Pastor Shane
Hyman's
Hyman's church.
church.
Mm-hmm. And then that church got closed, and then we started going to a different church, and then that's where I met my wife.
Cool.
And then there was some complicated business that happened there, and we left, and now we're at where we had been. But while we were at Crosby, by this point I had like 4 or 5 different youth pastors, and so I started thinking to myself, if I felt that way, I've had an interesting experience in the church.
Well, that is very interesting. That's and it's sad to even say this, but just listen to your story. It has become common to those who grew up in the church. Mm-hmm. Those who grew up in the church,
especially ones involved with leadership.
Yeah, ones who's involved in leadership. So they say the average tenure of a youth pastor is 2.5 years.
Yeah,
and growing up, it's same experience from probably the start of youth ministry. So I had this youth pastor who I really appreciated and love. I still love him to this day. He's a lead pastor off in another state, but when I get there, he's leaving, and I'm like, oh man. And so who I call my true youth pastor, he just left and went to California, back to California. He came from California.
Wait, when was this?
This was here recently.
And he went back to California?
He went back to California. So
now?
Yeah, right now. During this whole pandemic.
Big season of the Ronas?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And it's so cool, kind of full circle for him and everything like that. But he was my youth pastor for 4 years. And it just so happened to be my 4 years of high school. So I consider him more my youth pastor. He was just passionate, man. He was very passionate. He would get bloodshot red when he preached. He was just excited. He was a good youth pastor, man. He was a great youth pastor. And he ended up leaving the church after I graduated.
Leaving that church?
Leaving that church
okay.
and moving on to another church where he would stay another 10 plus years. I want to say he was there for at least 15 years at this other church as a youth pastor. Mm-hmm. And so him and his wife and his children now have moved on to lead pastor back in California this year. So that's kind of, and not like recently, not like as in pre-pandemic February or anything. Yeah. This was just like recently.
My heart goes out to a lot of those California pastors right now because there's a certain good fight that they're fighting right now that is
absolutely
kind of shocking to me that they're having to fight in 2020 in the United States of America.
In the United States of America. And it's funny on that subject, I think the last time something big sparked out of that California movement was something like Azusa Street and everything like that, and you had a few other things that kind of happened back then in that area.
I'm not familiar. Can you?
So the Azusa Street revival, just to kind of give you a gist about it, and it's funny. At the time, it was a black minister. And actually, it was a few black. There was more people involved than if you read the story. But
what time period?
This was back in the early 1900s, very early 1900s. Okay. And so this Azusa Street revival takes off. Thousands of people get saved. People are getting healed. So many crazy things are happening at this point in time. Movements started breaking up out of this revival, and God started doing incredible things through this. Through this black minister, William Seymour was his name. He's featured in some Assembly of God text and everything like that. The funny thing about him, he wasn't really accepted in most places. So at this Azusa Street, people don't know this, but he was actually, and before he came on stage, he had to wait outside. When he went to Bible college, he could not learn, he could not listen or be taught in class. So he had to be, his desk was, if he had one, was outside in the hallway. Because he couldn't be in there because of the color of his skin. I know it's a crazy situation, but so I believe, just like what God used this Azusa Street revival at that time, now God is going to use this moment, these ministers who have, and I'm a firm believer saying that pain will always produce authenticity, who you really are. And I say that because 5 years ago, and I'll get back to that as I say this, but 6 years ago this month, I had a younger brother who was tragically killed. He was tased to death by a police officer. He was tragically killed. I was faced with a situation. I had just stepped into youth ministry as the youth pastor at my home church, and I was faced with something. I could be angry, upset, and just forget about doing this youth ministry. Everybody would be understanding. My family just went through something horrible, so they would be understanding. Or I could live out everything that I've preached from the moment that I said yes to the Lord. And I chose that I was going to be the best representation of what it means to live out what you've preached from the moment you said yes in that moment. And here's the reason why. I learned this from a pastor years ago. When the worst of the worst happens to a believer, the world should see the best of the best come out of it. And so we when they don't see the best come out of those situations in believers, they don't get to see the authenticity of their faith, where they're sitting back and like, you know what, I know this is horrible, I know this is painful, but I'm trusting God. I'm gonna trust God. I'm gonna stand on His word. And so that is what's happening in California. These pastors are being told that they cannot go into their church, they cannot meet in large quantities, and they have to. They can't even worship. They can't even sing. Like singing a song, it's you're gonna spread the virus for just singing. You can go and protest. That's a whole nother story.
That is a whole other story. We'll get to that.
But you can't meet in a church. You can't sing. So you have pastors meeting on the beach in California, and it's not just one church. Several churches are coming together, and thousands of people are meeting on the beach Sundays and Wednesdays, and they're experiencing a movement of God's Spirit that they would never have experienced in their individual churches.
You know, I think there's something interesting that to kind of go along with that. There's definitely something interesting happening in California right now because, for one, there's a mass exodus happening right now.
Absolutely.
From out of California.
Absolutely.
Pretty much, if you can afford it, you're gone. Why would you stay? And even with celebrities like Joe Rogan is a notable one who's just up and left.
He just left. He was tired of. I think he's coming to Texas.
Yeah, I think he went to Austin.
Wow.
And then Elon Musk is another one. Which he was early on. He kind of kicked the ball rolling on moving out of California. I think there's just a bunch of people like, why in the world would I stay?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to stay. I can leave. Why would I stay? Interesting enough, I got one of the Joe Rogan's comedian buddies, Ari Shafar.
Yeah.
I think that's how you pronounce his name. He said he was going to stay.
Yeah.
And kind of fight. I think it's personally, I think from based on his worldview, it's kind of a lost cause. But, but as far as that, I think it's interesting because, like I said, if you have money, why would you stay?
Yeah.
Which leaves an interesting kind of, I don't want to say power vacuum, but an interesting influence vacuum that I think that it's also a similar dilemma with the church.
Yeah.
With pastors who maybe they're in the position, why would I stay? I have the money, I can leave and go do something else. I've got my degree in whatever, engineering, whatever possibly, and I can go do something else. But I think where it's more complicated with the pastor is that, you're not just thinking about your immediate family, you're also thinking about your, for lack of a better term, your flock.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I think it's interesting that I think what we're going to happen is start as that influence vacuum grows. I think we're going to start seeing an influx of influence from the church,
right?
Especially, and even at a base level, the church in California has definitely become somewhat of an underdog.
Yeah.
Which is going to be really interesting also.
Very, very interesting.
So it's going to be kind of the church versus, I think California is moving away from the celebrity influence and the celebrity influence into the influence of the church versus the local politicians.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that's going to be good, because this is now the microscope is going to be on, I say the microscope, the spiritual microscope is going to be on them, because for so long, I don't want to call them celebrity preachers, but you now have an opportunity to put your faith where your actions are. And so you're going to have, I think just personally, just kind of thinking about all this, it depends on what they're going to advocate for. Are you going to advocate for the gospel, that you're called to preach and that you're called to distribute throughout the world? That's what the scriptures say. Or are you going to advocate causes that you weren't never called to advocate? I know it sounds crazy, and we'll go into that. We can go into that later, because my viewpoint on what we're seeing in the world today has changed in the last couple of weeks through scripture. And I based it all through scripture, and I'm just like, man, I thought, there were some things we just were never called to advocate. And so, like I said, we'll go through that. And so I think now these pastors are going to, and I encourage them, I'm like, who am I? But, at the end of the day, if I can encourage any pastor that's going through what they're going through in California, just to remember all the missionaries, all the pastors in these third world countries that are under scrutiny, that are always on the chop block for death and everything like that. Just remember, they stand tall, and yet their outcome may not be as favorable as your outcome. Your outcome may be just the fact that, you're shunned by a few, but their outcome is not only are they shunned, but they're put to death. Fine.
That's
put to death and everything like that. And so
other people are getting put to death, and you're getting blacklisted and fined. So it's not the same fight as bringing the gospel to, say, China.
Right.
Oh my God, China.
That's a whole nother story there too.
Mulan came out for $30 on Disney Plus Premium Access.
Wow.
I know.
Oh my goodness.
Well, first of all, I've watched the reviews, and it's not a good movie apparently.
Wow.
Second of all, who wants to root for China right now?
yeah. It's like kind of hard. It's kind of hard to want to root for anything that they got coming out. And, it's funny. Disney kind of has its hand in everything. And I realize now, as an adult, that most of the movies that we watched growing up had some form of propaganda in it, and everything like that. And so,
it's really hard. I think it's interesting, because I think it's really hard to kind of suss out the difference between propaganda and an earnest kind of messaging.
Yeah.
That. Because I think who's the author? I have one of his books right there. I think it's the Brothers Karamazov. I don't see it. I can't remember who the author was. Let me find that book real quick. It should be right there. back to action. Did you grow up with Power Rangers?
Oh, I love Power Rangers.
So we would be playing dodgeball all the time, and there would be someone who would go use the restroom on a break real quick. And then, because this is before we knew about TV scheduling.
Right.
We just knew when it was on, you watched it.
You watched it,
I didn't know anything about, it's on every day, except for Saturday morning cartoons. I knew that at 6 o'clock every Saturday, Heavy Gear was going to be on.
Oh, yeah.
I love that show.
That was a good show.
And at 5 a.m. every weekday was Starship Troopers Roughnecks.
Man, oh my God.
That show was amazing.
That was amazing. Man, that brings me back. I remember as a kid, one of the cool things that me and my brothers looked forward to was Saturday night. So Nickelodeon would go off air.
Oh, they're Nick at Night?
They're Nick at Night. So they would they would have something on Saturday called Snick.
Yeah, I remember Snick.
And so Snick, they would have just a certain lineup, but one of the things that me and my brothers loved looking, and it's probably bad now, but it was Are You Afraid of the Dark?
I love that show.
Man, I love that. We grew up on it. We just loved it.
You say it's probably bad now, but a few episodes were genuinely creepy.
Yeah, they were.
And I was surprised. Man. And I was always more of an Are You Afraid of the Dark guy than a Goosebumps guy. Oh my God.
Me too.
So the first night Goosebumps came on, I had to miss it because I got in trouble.
Oh no.
Okay, so I don't know if I should say the story. I'll cut it out if I feel like it. So my neighbor and he would always like take things one step too far whenever we were playing. And so
I had that neighbor too.
At the time, mind you, I thought that getting hit with like a shoe was like the worst kind of pain I could experience.
Wow.
I was young. When did Nickelodeon, when did Goosebumps air?
Goosebumps probably
2005?
I mean,
95.
95, 94, 95, something. Maybe 96.
So I was like 5, 6 years old, maybe.
Right.
Maybe a little bit older. I can't remember. But anyways, so I had a baseball bat in my hand. I don't remember why. There was no ill intent at the time that I had this aluminum baseball bat in my hand. But for some reason, he thought it was a good idea to pick up a shoe and threaten to throw it at me. And I was scared. Like I said, I thought that's the worst kind of pain you can experience.
Right.
And mind you, my dad was a police officer, and he used to spank me. And I thought being hit with a shoe was the worst kind of pain you could get. And I knew pain by this time.
Wow, I understand.
And so he wound up, and he was right about to, he was going to throw it at me. So I went thunk and hit him on the side. And I just remember him grabbing his side and dropping to the floor, dropped the shoe. And I was like, and this is right outside the side of my house.
Oh my goodness.
I dropped the bat and I ran inside to my room. And I was like, the chips are going to land where they do.
Yeah.
But I'm safe in my room for now.
So you got the mom next door coming over with the kid, and
I don't think so. I think he told my brother, who then told my dad, who then said, you know what? You're going to be in your room the rest of the night. And I don't even think he realized Goosebumps was going to be premiering that night. But I missed the premiere because of my neighbor who I hit because he wanted to threaten throwing a shoe at me. That's neither here nor there. Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Oh man!
One more thing. Nickelodeon. Do you remember that?
I do remember Nickelodeon.
Animorphs.
Yeah, I love Animorphs.
They're gonna remake it.
Really?
Yes.
Man,
I feel like they're gonna ruin it though.
Yeah, it's
not the show that was that great. Probably.
I think that it's funny you say that because I felt like they ruined, and I loved the movie. But I felt like it was. I mean, of course, you got to do it dark and everything like that. But Power Rangers, the movie, came out in 2017.
I liked it,
and I loved the movie.
Okay,
but
great.
Are they going to absolutely do another one, or because they left us on a cliffhanger? So
they're not doing another one with that same cast.
Oh man,
yeah,
that was a good cast.
I love Montgomery Dacre Montgomery.
Yeah, he was good. Red Ranger. Yeah, he did good.
Oh my gosh,
he did good.
I dug it. So for me, it was just the right amount of campy. Mm-hmm. I didn't want it to be too serious because Power Rangers was campy.
Yeah, it was.
But I loved it. I loved that movie.
It was a good movie.
And it's even whenever like everybody in the theater was probably my age at the time, and as soon as that go Power Rangers, everyone was like, yeah.
That just brings back so much childhood.
I got chills. I was like, this is going back there.
Man,
this is going back there. I loved it. I loved that movie.
It was a good movie. It really was. I loved me. As a matter of fact, me and a buddy, we were just sounding like, man, did you know the origin story of Power Rangers? Like, no, dude, I lived it, man. Like, so we were just talking about it, and I told him, I was like, do you remember when Power Rangers went dark? He's like, what do you mean? He says, when Lord Zed came into the picture, I said, there was like a couple of episodes where I'm like, man,
it did get pretty dark.
Yeah, it got dark. I was
for
like,
kids anyways.
Yeah, right. And I was just sitting there like, but at the same time, you know, you had Goosebumps, they had Are You Afraid of the Dark, and so but you know what? It's different now. It's just different now. Those shows, you know, back in those days, I say, you know, for us, we can say that now, but back in those days, certain characters were comic relief, and now if you make fun of those characters, oh man, I mean, you're canceled. You're canceled.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting there like, wow, man, how far we've come.
There's a guy with a YouTube channel. He's called Lindy Bage. I really like his channel.
I've heard of him.
He's typically like goes over like medieval type of content, but every once in a while he'll have like a semi-philosophical video, and he made a video entitled "Laugh at Minorities." Right. And it was interesting. Of course, it's a very abrasive title.
Right.
And so I watched it, which I watched a few of his other like Lloyd Rants kind of videos, and his argument is that anything that you can't laugh at is taboo.
Wow.
So you're not accepting it. And it was for me, that's probably one of the best arguments I've ever heard for stopping this nonsense. Because if you're not allowed to laugh at something, then you're basically making it sacred in a sense.
Yeah.
And while at the same time you're making it sacred, you're making it taboo, and you're not making it equal.
Wow, that's good.
Very interesting argument to me, and I haven't heard a good counter argument to that either.
Man, that's pretty deep and good, man. That reminds me of the Truman Show. Man, one of my favorite parts of the Truman Show is the guy who's kind of like a part of the whole espionage of the Truman Show. He says, you know, we adapt to the reality to which we are presented. And so I'm sitting back like, wow, that's so true. So you have now those who have the platform, if they declare the platform and the influence. So there's a difference. You can have a platform with no influence, but you know, but when you have the platform and the influence, you have the ability to shape culture. Now, everybody has the ability to shape culture, but those with the influence has the ability to shape it faster than those who are trying to gain the influence and everything like that. And so we live now in a culture where certain people set the precedents, and if they say it's wrong, no matter if it's right, it'll be wrong in the majority, or what they want you to perceive as the majority and everything like that.
You know, as an aside to that, there's a guy I love to listen to. I just check every so often to make sure my wife doesn't need anything.
That's all right.
There's a guy I love listening to. His name's Coleman Hughes.
Okay. Yeah.
I love Coleman. I think he's a young guy, but he's so smart.
Yeah, he's very smart.
And I don't say that just because I might agree with a lot of what he says. I say that because of, like, to me, you got to be really smart if you can present an argument and then somebody refutes it, and then you could say, okay, I see the flaws in my particular argument,
right,
but let me get a little bit more specific, because I'm not going to change what I believe because I've sussed this out.
Right.
But let me get a little bit more specific and present a better argument.
Okay, yeah.
And so he's a seriously smart guy. I really like listening to that guy. And where was I going with this? What were we just talking about?
Right.
So he, oh man, I was going somewhere with this. What were we just talking about?
We were talking about kind of like the reality of the culture and everything that
oh yeah. With. So one of the things that he was talking about was, and it had to do with everything that we're dealing with right now, but he was saying that he hopes that everybody who's kind of on this outrage train right now, he hopes that their children have more grace on them than they're having on the past generations.
Wow, it's good.
Because like there's been like all this stuff has been happening so fast because things used to be one way and now they're different.
They're different. Yeah.
And even leaving out the better or worse argument,
right.
They're different. But imagine how much more things in a couple more generations are going to be,
Yeah.
and how these people are going to be vilified.
Yeah.
In which I think that there's a certain level of understanding there, because they keep going further and further at the drop of the hat.
Absolutely.
And you see that with companies like Gillette.
Yeah.
Who at one day they want to have this big old picture of all these models that have Gillette across their butt and skin tight outfits, and then the next day they want to tell me that I'm toxically masculine.
Yeah.
And it's funny. It's interesting to me.
It is.
I'm like, you in particular don't get to tell me about my toxicity.
That's right.
You need to deal with that yourself.
That's absolutely.
And then once that I've seen that you've changed properly, then you can probably start having an open conversation.
Yeah.
And just start preaching at me all of a sudden.
Man, that's...
Like, I've been in the, and I used to tell this to my youth boys all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I was never a youth pastor, but I worked in youth for a long time. I used to tell them all the time, if you're not accused of being gay in high school, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah,
man, that's true.
That was my story in high
Man,
school.
yeah,
like
absolutely.
if somebody, these guys, like high school guys are not as bad as middle school guys.
Man, I had it bad in middle school, man.
Oh my gosh, middle school is the worst.
I was kind of a bully a little bit in middle school, only because I felt like I didn't want to be that guy getting punished, and I say that is because I remember in 6th and 7th grade, there was like the big guy on campus type, who was like the guy who kind of like recess. He was Bob, in that old school
King Bob.
Yeah, King Bob. He was like, he's
King
like,
Bob was tough, but he was fair.
but he was fair. and that's kind of how this guy was. He's like, dude, you're supposed to be in like 9th grade now, but you're still in the 6th. But he kind of, I didn't want to get bullied by him, but he never really was a bully. He was just more of, that kid that should be in his right grade but isn't, and everything like that. And so I remember I had the worst attitude in my 6th and 7th grade year, and then my 8th grade year, things just started to turn around for me a little bit. And I was like, you know what, there's actually people are coming out of the woodwork. Oh, you're a Christian. What does that mean? We really didn't know what it meant. Truly, we just know that, we go to church. Okay, so we kind of sat in our own little group and everything like that.
But I feel like if somebody also, though, especially at that young age, attacks that identity, we don't even know what that really means. We just go to church. But if somebody attacks that identity, then we, at least me probably at the time, I would get up in arms about it. Like, I would be deeply offended that you just attacked my identity.
Man.
And even though I didn't even realize what that identity was.
So I think our generation. So if you grew up, so I'll say this, if you've graduated high school pre 2010, I'll use that as a stopping point, as a beginning point. So 2010, say back to 2000, if you graduate during that time, we went through a lot of stuff, but we were also struggling there was a lot of identity issues then at that point in time, but I wouldn't call our generation they were fearless, but not necessarily, it wasn't always visible. So, and I say that because, in between that time frame, people would question, hey man, are you a Christian or not? You're a Christian? And yeah, we would get offended, and we would like verbally express, oh man, that's messed up, man. Like now you're coming against me because I'm a Christian or this and that, but it never went further than that. Now 2010 on, I really feel like if we could equip this generation with what it means to be a Christian and what it really means to be to live out a Christian life. This generation is so fearless, man. I have seen where it's crazy. I know this is going to be a sad example, but in my parents' hometown in Louisiana, this is a whole nother subject we probably want to talk about a little bit later, black on black crime, but Black on black crime is so. I mean, these are teenagers killing people, killing other teenagers, and and kind of the hood mentality there is like they take it like a G almost, you know, and so I remember just hearing the story of this 16-year-old who was disrespected by some other 19-year-old guys or something like that. So he takes a AK-47 and mows them down. I mean, like 6 people lost their life in a matter of seconds. But he never thought twice about it.
Yeah, we've lost the art of escalation.
We have. And so we're dealing with a different generation, and I feel like now if they could just take that fearless, and they are. Some of them are the rioters and everything that you see in the world today. I guarantee you, we could take a genuine poll. I'm not talking about the bias poll of only your group,
Right.
But if you could take an overall poll, majority of those rioters and looters and everything that we see, and we got to call it what it is. We can't just hide the fact. They're young. They're teenagers. Yeah. They're you know, most of them probably can't vote. And so that's another reason they want to be heard and everything like that. And so, and they want to be seen and everything like that. And so if they could take that fearlessness and push it into something more productive, like building, I have a friend who's a cop as well. He used to teach me all the time, tell me all the time about the broken window effect. If they would put that energy into fixing that window and elevating that window, elevating that opportunity, people, I mean, we would see peace. We'd see.
Yeah. And the idea, well, just in case there's nobody that's heard about that, the idea is there could be an abandoned house. And as soon as one kid has the gumption to throw a rock in one of the windows, right after that, every other kid walking by is going to, and I think it's interesting because it's like you see a thing that's fine and you leave it alone, and then you perceive it to be broken. Yeah. And then you're like, okay, well, somebody else already did. Yeah. It's either broken or it's not. And once it's broken, then it's kind of free game.
Yeah, it's free game.
Interesting effect, psychological study too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, you know, I feel like we are, you know, I've never been one of those pastors. Like, to me, this is just me as a pastor.
What kind of, are you a senior pastor or a youth pastor? Or?
So I'm kind of like, so right now I'm back in the youth outreach kind of mindset. Will I eventually get back into lead pastoring? I believe so. I don't know how much I could tell his story, but so I actually was church planning and put that on hold to help a friend who's going through some things, who's a pastor. And so I'm helping him out at his church right now. And so for the foreseeable future, I know that time will come to an end, and then I'll be pushed back into church planning again, because that's my heart and all that good stuff. But so as a pastor, you know, with that hat on, I really, you know, I say we're living in the last times, you know, according to the Bible.
I have some thoughts on that. But go ahead.
But I lean more on the side of when Jesus is ready to come back, he'll come back, and there's nothing that I can possibly do about it other than just be prepared through relationally and spiritually and everything like that. So I am not one of those who will dwell on end time prophecy and this and that and everything. And there's nothing wrong with those. You know, if that's what they want, if that's their cup of tea or their pot of coffee, that's fine.
I disagree, but go ahead.
But you know, there's nothing wrong with that. And so for me, I don't necessarily dwell on those things, because I know that they've already been written. It's already been etched in stone.
And I think that's the point.
Yeah. And so,
have you ever seen the movie No Country for Old Men?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it, but I have a friend of mine. I know he's seen it because he's tried telling me about it.
So you should watch it. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. And there's a few monologues towards the end. One where one of the characters, Tommy Lee Jones, is talking about a dream that he had. Couple of dreams that he has, which is amazing. But whenever I see all these people talking about, surely when the end times, I'm like, as soon as Jesus said, they know not what they do.
Yeah.
We're in the end times, in my opinion, is what it seems like to me. And, you talk about like, oh yeah, but this is happening and this is happening. I was like, yeah, okay.
Oh, but he mentioned that.
and so I think there's this, that Tommy Lee Jones character, he's a sheriff and he decided to go ahead and quit because he said he feels outmatched. Wow. And I think he's talking to his uncle, and which they did on purpose. His uncle looks a little bit younger than he is.
Wow.
And his uncle, basically, long story short, so I'm going to start doing like original content, and I'll probably get into this a little bit more, like doing my own videos on here. But his uncle basically ends up telling him, "You're being vain.
Wow.
Like what you've got is nothing new. What you're experiencing is nothing new. People have been experiencing this as old as time."
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a little bit vain to think that you're so special and what you're dealing with is so terrible that you're going to start talking about how it's the end of time.
Yeah.
and so that was something that I took really to heart. And it just kind of gets to me a little bit. I'm like, you're being so vain thinking it's the end of times right now.
Yeah.
Get over it.
Yeah.
People like, and it's also, like, have you seen Fiddler on the Roof?
Yeah.
It's that part towards the end whenever Mottel, I believe his name is, he talks to the what's the main guy's name?
So I know who you're talking. Mottel's talking to him on the roof with what's that guy's name, dude? Now you got
the main character. What's his name? I can't remember his name. I love that guy.
I know who you're talking about. So yeah,
but
my mind's...
He's talking to him at the end whenever they're getting displaced from their village, and he's like, the Reverend's always talking about how, or not Reverend, Rabbi's always talking about how, Jesus is going to be coming back. Like, wouldn't this be a really great time for Jesus to come back? And, it's kind of that same thing. Like, no, stop talking about the end times. You're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, you're going to deal with it.
Deal with it. And
Absolutely.
so that's kind of how I feel about it.
It's funny. So I've been kind of unpacking scripture lately, just kind of and I know it sounds bad. We always use scripture to justify our cause and beliefs, but I've been
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, man. I've been kind of unpacking that lately. And so I'm looking at what Jesus says in Matthew 24, where he talks about how, two will be at the grind mill, two will be walking in the field, one is taken, another one left, and everything like that. And he's talking about all these different things. You're going to be going about your ordinary day. You're going to be going about your ordinary life. He says, as it was in the days of Noah. And really, none of us were there. None of us were there in the days of Noah. So we don't really know. We know that it was bad. We know that Noah and his family really were found to be the most righteous in the entire world at that point,
which is a darn shame.
Yeah, it's a darn shame. So let's take it from that example. So if Noah was the only one living for the Creator at the time, that's kind of how they knew him. If he was the only one living for God at that point in time, he was the only one righteous at that point in time. That tells us that, we would see more of a remnant of Christianity than you would. I'm not saying that that's not what he's talking about, but I would think that we don't know really how bad it really will be, because we have not been there. We only are known what we're told. But so I say that to say this is when Jesus is explaining of everything that's going to happen, and he says, and when you see all these things happen, then you will see the Son of Man coming in his glory and with his holy angels. I feel to believe 100% that whatever, when people have, especially, let's just, for example, there has been people for years and now even prevalent now that have these prophetic dreams. I'm not even going to use the quotations. They have these prophetic dreams about things that Jesus already talked about, that these things would happen. And so does God still give people dreams? Absolutely. I felt like for the longest, just as an example, for the longest time, I always had a fear, and that was more of like a reverence. Man, do I really want to see the face of Christ? He is holy and I'm not. And I don't know if that's something that in this state that I can endure and I can take. And so then I started realizing, I was like, so I started having these dreams about seeing Jesus, but I never got to see his face. I've always saw like the backside of him and everything like that. And in my, I can explain to you, but you know what? Someone else could have the same dream and have a totally different viewpoint of what Jesus looked like and everything. So, but just recently, the other day, I had a dream where he turned and he looked at me in my face, and I just remember being frozen with fear, because here was my interpretation of what Jesus looked like in my dream. I felt like I saw him. I saw his face. And you know what? He looked like an average, ordinary individual. There was nothing about his appearance that at this point in time. So if I saw him, if this was really the true image of Christ, it was the image before he ascended. So before he went to the cross. So the Bible says there was nothing about his appearance that would draw us to him. Like he looked like an ordinary person from that time frame, and so I was like, man, I was wow, so, but that's the dream that I had. Now, am I going to go preach that from the rooftops? Absolutely not. Why? Because I realized that sometimes it's my thought process at the time, what I've been thinking about, and also the chili dogs that I ate the night before and everything like that. Those play a factor in my dreams.
Or the energy. I have the wildest dreams when I have an energy drink.
Right same here. I drank a C4 and I felt like, I felt like I wasn't real. I was like,
yeah, if it hits while you're finally asleep, oh my goodness, some wild stuff happens.
I'm telling you. So those things play a part. And so you have ministers who have these dreams, and they talk about coin shortages. They talk about 4 blood moons, and they sell books, and they talk about how they saw this person and that person and these things happening. And
I think you just hit the nail on the head. They sell, and I think that's part of it. And far be it from me to say that some people are not genuine in their concern and trying to get out this knowledge, but I think there's a really important level of discernment that somebody needs to have, in my estimation, whenever something, especially with the pulpit. Right. I'm very particular about the pulpit.
Amen.
Because that dream that you had, and you can disagree with me, but it sounds like that was for you.
It was.
And in where you're at, and it sounds like what you're describing is that it was just for you.
Yeah, wasn't for anyone else.
And it sounds to me like a lot of times people will say stuff that was just for them from the pulpit.
Absolutely.
Well, let me get this thing back up and running. Just make sure. Perfect. Okay. And so yeah, I kind of got that from my dad from a young age, to have a healthy. To not take everything at face value.
It's good.
To try to dig a little bit deeper. And it kind of started with the show Smallville.
Yeah, I love that show.
I love that show too. I was watching it. I don't remember what season this was in, but it was whenever he gets his red ring.
Yeah.
And not just the first time, but the second time. And he's looking for it, and his friend's there, and he's like, what are you doing? You know what that does to you?
Yeah.
And he's like, it makes me feel better. And my dad was watching that episode, and he was like, what do you think that ring means? I was like, oh, of course. I'm just watching the show. I was like, oh, it's red kryptonite. It makes him act like this, so he wants it because he's having a hard time. And he's like a drug? And I was like, no, not like I was getting, for some reason, I was getting super defensive about the show. I guess partly because I thought he was going to make me stop watching it.
Yeah,
maybe. And he was like, look, I'm not trying to attack your show. I'm just saying you need to kind of, read between the lines and what you're being shown.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was like, you know what? Then I was like, you know what? Maybe he's. And over the years, I was like, nope, that was pretty much a drug. And so it's funny. So like I've always had this, and I was probably like 12 at that point. I've had kind of like a healthy scrutinization of kind of any part of authority that I've tried to look at. And And that's part of it. Whenever I see people just say things that sound like God was speaking to them directly for their own personal life, and then they want to, go on and talk about it. It's like the difference between. So I love the movie Aliens.
Yeah,
It's also one of my all-time. I love that movie so much, and I'm gesturing because I have a poster of it on the wall. But even though that's my favorite movie in the franchise, I understand that the first one, Alien, is a better film.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a difference between that. Like, personally, my favorite is Aliens. But
Right.
I understand that Alien is a better movie. Like, I'm not going to get into an argument about that. I think that's
Right.
part of it. You got to understand whenever something is just for you and something is general.
Yeah, general. Yeah, absolutely. And I you're right. So we definitely so it's easier to sell fear
Oh, yeah.
than it is to sell faith. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. It's easier to sell fear because people want to believe this is the end. You just have those people out
There's
there.
a release of responsibility.
It's a release of responsibility. Wait, I don't have to wait. The end's coming, so I don't have to really be serious about this or be serious about that. And you have people. You have people out there. It's like, I'm not gonna have kids. I'm not gonna get married because Jesus is coming back any moment. Well, Jesus actually says he addressed that issue. To me, he addresses that issue in the same chapter. People up until the day Noah entered the ark, people were getting married and being given in marriage, not knowing that destruction was going to come upon them suddenly, not knowing that. So, but is he saying that that's going to happen in this time? No, this is what I believe he's saying. Live your life. Live your life. I mean, you have to go about living your life because if those people knew that the end was coming, and see, a lot of people don't realize, and I've had to study some extra biblical texts to kind of get a reference of what was going on. There was a lot more going on during the days of Noah than just human beings can comprehend. So, because there's biblical texts that talk about that there were Nephilims prevalent in the world at that point in time and everything like that. Often wondered, how did Noah by himself build that big ark? Now they say that it took 120 years to build, so that's understandable and everything like that. I won't go into, like I said, there's some things I won't. There are some texts, some translated texts.
So what do you make of like those things in the Bible that people generally don't want to get into, other than biblical scholars? Things like the Nephilim, because all in all, it doesn't sound to me like it doesn't. We'll say the Great Commission. Like, in terms of the Great Commission, it doesn't seem to change things too much. So I understand why people don't generally talk about it. And then for most people, they're like, well, that's the frou-frou stuff of the Bible that we don't really need to get into.
So I think that, and I think that brings back to like what are we advocating? So when we go through Scripture, from Genesis to Revelations, the message point was always focused on new heaven and new earth. And so once the fall of man happens, God he saw it coming already, but he orchestrates life. So there's key things that happen throughout the time of Christ, from Old Testament to Christ. He orchestrates it in a way. He's like, okay, I'm going to use these key people and these keys. I know they're capable of doing it. And he could have used anyone. He used a donkey. So, but I think that the message has been pretty clear. Crisis came. They looking for redemption. Redemption shows up. They're looking for the promised land. The promised land will be, and as God says, it will be the new heaven and the new earth and everything like that. And so,
I think I accidentally turned that on. What I want to do is flip this. Where is that switch? There it is. Got it. My bad.
That's all right. So it's like, I think, what are we advocating? So I think that, for example, when I started working a few years ago, I worked in a refinery, and I met a friend of mine who he's a realtor now. I actually kind of spoke that into his life. I was like, dude, you're selling more houses than you can afford to even be here, So he ended up going into realtor full time. He's doing great with that.
Oh, awesome.
But he was like, man, there's more there's more in scriptures. Have you ever thought about this, and this? And so at that time, I was like, man, let me just kind of expand my brain and everything like that. So I would read about Nephilims and how, just for an example, like I said, I would never preach this from the pulpit, but that it took Noah only 5 years to build the ark, and it took him 120 years to proclaim the message to everybody to turn their life around. And so I was sitting there thinking, I was like, man, well, who helped him build the ark? Well, a lot of people believe that these fallen angels, these watchers, and you'll see kind of that in the Hollywood version of the movie Noah that happened back in the day.
And it's as far as that movie, because I was like, oh, that wasn't the story of the Bible, but it was interesting because another person I love to listen to, his name is Bishop Robert Barron.
I've heard of him.
He's such a smart guy. and truthfully, one of my favorite things about him is his gift for his sense of grace. Right. I think is amazing. And it's something that I really, really look up to him for. But he was talking about, because he went and saw it, and one of the things he does is he talks about movies.
Right.
He's a movie buff, and he was saying that the movie reminded him of there's certain traditions with that have oral stories,
right,
and that it kind of and they change things to particularly fit the culture that they're speaking to, but with the generalization of the lesson of the story.
Okay, yeah.
And so he said that movie kind of reminded him a lot about that kind of tradition.
Right.
And that kind of gave me a new. I haven't seen the movie, but it kind of gave me a new thought process about something like that.
It's a good movie. It's a good Hollywood movie. And so yeah, you have those thought process. So it makes you want to dive deeper. If anything, a lot of people they oh, that's Hollywood, this and that. Well, if it gets a lot of people to want to pick up their Bible, that's a good thing. And so and so in the movie, it talks about, it kind of shows that these watchers, these fallen angels, kind of helped him out and everything like that, and those are things that could possibly be and everything like that. But I feel like the narrative of the gospel of the scriptures is, Christ has come. He's coming back again. It kind of reminds me, I know this is kind of a cliche, but I just got through from binge watching this with my parents on Netflix, is the show Merlin.
I haven't seen any of it yet.
So Merlin is it's an older show, but I think it just got on Netflix or something like that. And at the end, you have it follows Merlin and King Arthur and everything like that. So King Arthur, I'm a little upset because it's not the King Arthur that I grew up with, and I'm like, wait, what happened to?
I grew up with Antoine Fuqua's Clive Owen's King Arthur.
Yeah,
I love that movie.
So I'm like, what in the world happened? So this kind of goes into a deeper, more meaning and everything. But towards the end of the show, Arthur dies. And as he dies in the show, and of course he dies in the books, most of the books and everything like that as well. As he dies, Merlin's just so distraught. He's like, my purpose was to serve him. My purpose was to keep him alive. And so this dragon comes and tells him, he's like, you've done everything you could. Listen, when, I forget the name when he called it, but so it's like it was their Britain, their Europe was called a different name at that point in time. So when this country, when this world needs, is at its greatest needs, Arthur will rise again. And so it started maybe realizing, like, so at our point, and we could be 200 years away from that. We could be 10 years away from that. It could be 2 minutes away from that. But at our greatest need, because the scripture tells us that at the right time, Christ showed up. So at our greatest time in history for that generation, Christ will appear.
But what does that mean in terms, because as believers, we are essentially meant to fill that role.
Right.
So what does that mean for us then?
So I it's a good point. So we are the only Jesus that many will see without picking up a Bible. And there's so many representations of who Jesus is right now through people. I'm not going to mention names, but there's a televangelist who needs a $64 million jet and was doing.
I don't think you need to name names.
And mention and does this campaign to. I'm just sitting there like, wow, like. So that's the Jesus some people see, and it's funny that person has a platform and influence, and so many people are so blindly, deceived.
And really, for me, the problem isn't that. Look, if you want a jet and you can afford a jet, then by all means buy a jet. I don't care. But I think that for me, where the controversy comes in is whenever you start telling me that Jesus wants you to have a jet.
Yeah.
I'm like, and let's be real, maybe he does. I don't need you to tell me that.
Yeah, that's it.
in my opinion. Maybe Jesus told you need a jet. That is not for you to tell me.
And I feel like if Jesus says, I want you to have this jet so that you can be this much faster than everybody else to get to preach the gospel.
You have the internet and you have virtual services right now, but as Jesus, I'm telling you, you need this jet.
You need this jet.
And look, I'm poking fun, and maybe he heard Jesus tell him that or something. I have my doubts, but even still.
Well, the story's changed now. Now he.
What's the story now?
The story now
for this unnamed person.
So he doesn't need a jet now. And so, that was just a metaphor for something else, I guess. So the whole story now is keeping the ministry going, I guess, beyond them. And so, it's funny that we laugh about this, but that's how comical, the representation of who Christ has become to some people in the world. You can talk to different people. So we all come across different people in our respective circles and life and everything like that. You have some people that honestly have no genuine knowledge of who Jesus truly is to them, and then you have some that are like, well, I sent my money to this person and I never got healed, or this never happened, and so I think the authenticity of what we're called to do is we lose sight of what God really called us to advocate. He never called us to advocate a cause other than go and preach the gospel. And when we go and preach the gospel, he tells us some people will not accept your message. Move on, keep preaching the gospel. Some of you are going to die. That's all right. The gospel needs to continue to be advanced.
That's a risk I'm willing to take.
It's like he says back, and I can't imagine how, as a disciple, sitting there and knowing that you're part of the 12 and you're seeing the miracles and everything, and all of a sudden you realize that, oh wait, I signed up to die.
But metaphorically and possibly physically,
and everything like that. It's kind of like that moment when John's like sitting at when Peter's sitting there is like, wait, John gets to live forever? Hold on, wait. So, but I feel like at that point in time, he's like, you keep pressing on, keep pressing forward, because the Bible tells us that in the end, when the new heaven and new earth is here, the former things have been passed away, nor will they come to mind. So what we perceive now in this world as issues, ministers, and I say this, so I'm going to go and just kind of open up the can of worms for that. There are some things that we advocate as Christians that will only have an earthly reward. only have an earthly gain, only have an earthly perspective. But doesn't mean that it's not important. So I use that example as racial equality.
Well, and then we'll go deeper into if it's equality or equity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good point. Why is that never a true issue in the scriptures when Jesus tells us to go and preach the gospel to every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? He said that's what I want you to advocate. I never told you to go and advocate racial injustice. Those things happen because the hearts of men are evil. That's those who have those issues and have those problems. That's a sin issue, not a skin issue. But I believe that when we as the church say, okay, there are some racial injustices that have happened in the world today, and we should stand against that, and we should say that is wrong, we have to understand that that is a earthly cause. That's not necessarily a spiritual cause. And I say that is because spiritually speaking, when John the Revelator was in Revelation, and like I said, this is just Frank's mindset. This is not necessarily canon or gospel,
You're right.
but when John the Revelator in the book of Revelation says that I saw in heaven a vast crowd that no man could count, people from every nation, every tribe, every tongue, and they were all worshiping the Lord, and they had palm branches in their hands, and they were singing "Worthy, is the Lamb." And so I look at that from this aspect. If the commandment was to go and preach the gospel to all the world, to all the world, I'm not necessarily focused. My focus shouldn't necessarily be on, okay, only go and preach to this group of people because they're your same race, or go and preach to this group of people because they're this, or go preach. I'm called to everybody. Mm-hmm. And so we know that God doesn't look at the outward appearance. King David, for example, he had several brothers who in appearance and in features looked like kings. But yet God didn't look at them. I mean, the prophet was like, "Oh man, surely this is him. Mm-hmm. This has got to be him, man. He's handsome. He's strong. He may not have a lot working on up there in the brain, but we can get him there and everything like that." And God's like, "No, that's not him. That's not who I've chosen." Man looks at the outward appearance. I look at the heart. I look at what happens on in here. And so I feel like we get so messed up. And Martin Luther King, who was really a great man of God. Let me first by starting off saying that he was a great man of God. I believe everything that he pushed for in the civil rights, that was an earthly reward, and they accomplished a lot. They accomplished a lot of great things that gave a lot of people what we're dealing with today, a lot of opportunities. Yeah. So I've never taken that away from them, because that's exactly what he did. He opened the door, him and several others. I mean, Rosa Parks, even Malcolm X to a point, these people open up the doors for equality in so many different ways, but that's an earthly reward. When you get to heaven, you're going to be like, once it's all said and done, what did that advance, how did that advance people coming to Jesus? Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor, so he did preach the gospel. That was his first objective. And so in the middle of his speeches, he would preach Jesus. He really would. And a lot of people don't realize that, and they'll omit those things because he was such a voice for the civil rights movement. But he really preached the gospel. He preached the gospel of love and a gospel of grace and forgiveness and everything like that. And so a lot of people were brought to a place of humility. But I feel personally that just for me, my viewpoint has changed because I was like, man, God never really called me to advocate my racial injustice.
So kind of go through your evolution in the past, I guess 2 or 3 months now. Like, kind of go through your evolution.
So that's a good point. So when I first started getting real to me is I always been one of those people, like, I kind of knew the media always pushed their agenda, but at the same time, I try to give them some benefit of the doubt that what they're telling me is truth. And so some stories started popping up, and I'm seeing certain people. Let's take George Floyd for example. Yeah. When I saw his story, I immediately felt uneased in my spirit. I was like, man, why would this guy kneel on his neck for almost an hour? Why would he do something like that? And so my mind and my heart started focusing on, like, man, this is happening too much in the world today. Like, and then so my fear at the time was, well, man, this kind of happened to my brother. So people are getting singled out. And I started getting angry. I was genuinely angry at this whole situation. But then what really caught my attention was, as I'm looking, this is May, early June, as I'm looking at so they showed this officer's knee on his neck, and then they show his mugshot. If you look at those pictures, it looks like two totally different men. To me, and I was like, man, I said, wait, that guy wasn't on his neck. I don't know who this guy is. This guy looks, honestly, the mugshot looked like an innocent man who got caught up in whatever, and I mean, looked like a totally different man. And then the man who's kneeling on the neck looked like a serpent, almost looked like had the facial features of a demonic facial feature. And I'm just sitting there like, but I believe 100%. You don't kneel on someone's neck. I'm gonna be the first one to say you don't do that. That's just not, to me, it's not humane. And as they go throughout the whole judicial process and prosecution, that should be reprimanded. That whole kneeling on the neck should be reprimanded personally. But I felt like there was more to the story. I've always felt like there was more to the story. Now they released kind of the whole footage of what's going on, and some people feel, I felt like I was blindsided. I felt like they sold us this one. Well, of course, the media wants to sell you one certain thing.
Have you seen Inglourious Bastards?
Yeah, I have.
So the opening scene is probably my favorite scene in all of cinema, just because I think it's just such a fantastic masterclass in suspense. But whenever he's talking to Mr. Lapadite, he tells him, he's like, so what have you heard? And he's like he's about to smoke his pipe, and he's like, only rumors. And he gets giddy and is like, I love rumors. Facts can be so misleading.
Yeah.
And I think there's just a fundamental truth to that, because, as you see this little snippet, and there's something, and I think in the George Floyd case, something genuine there to be upset about. Yeah. And then you start broadening everything around it, and you start saying, okay, so, and I think it's just the same general sense with people. You can find out about what's something that somebody did in a certain part, or something that they said, and then you just have like an image. They're this mug. Yeah. You have an image of who they are, and then through conversation you get to know them, and then you start kind of filling that out and being like, oh, this, just like me, this person, same with situations, is three-dimensional. And you start getting into that depth, and it's I think it's obvious that there's a certain level of frustration people should have with journalism, with the state of journalism right now.
There's a clip by Denzel Washington, and this clip has kind of gotten circulated around, but he is so true. So they kind of like it started off with him trying to put him as a certain supporter of a certain person or certain group or something like that, and he talks about that's the media. It doesn't have to necessarily be true. They just want to be first. And
I've seen that clip.
We'll sell it, and no matter who gets hurt in the process, let's just be first. And he says you have an obligation to tell the truth, and not necessarily be first, but to be truthful. And so I'm looking at this George Floyd situation, and I keep my mouth shut in a way because two things happened that happened for George Floyd that did not happen in 2014 for my brother. There was outrage. This was caught on camera. It was outraged. And so pandemonium happens in the streets. Just off of the reality in which they were presented. We were only presented with one side of things, not the whole scope, one side of things. So people were outraged about that. But prior to George Floyd, you had Ahmaud Arbery, who was, running through a neighborhood, and they painted that story one way until we got the full scope on that. Yeah. And so people are outraged and they're rioting and they're looting and all that stuff like that. We'll get into that later. So that happens. And then you look at 2014, the only people who were upset about what happened to my brother was his immediate family and friends. The media painted him one way, but his family and friends were the only ones truly upset and boisterous about what happened to him. It wasn't an election year. So I'm going to throw it out there. It wasn't an election year. 2020, it's an election year. And for some people make this out to be life and death. I mean, this is life or death, man. Like we're in the middle of a fight. We're in the middle of a revolution and this and that. And so a wise politician said, I say a wise politician, a politician who feels like they're wise in their own eyes says, you always want to capitalize on a good crisis.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I felt about it. And so I realized two things. That two tragedies happened on 2 different years with 2 different viewpoints. And I look at the situation that happened with my brother. I started to really think, and a lot of my family members, they believe different from me, and that they're entitled to that. We'll talk about that too. But for me personally, I started thinking about, man, I don't know if this cop woke up on Sunday, September 28th, 2014. I don't know if he woke up and said, I'm going to kill a black man today. I'm going to taste him. I don't think he woke up with that on his mind. I don't believe he woke up with the mindset that I'm going to put on my badge. I'm going to serve and protect these people, but I'm going to go and headhunt somebody. And if anything, it's going to be someone black. I don't believe that. Because genuinely, most cops that I've ever came across with, even the ones with attitudes, are typically good cops. I have ran into more good cops than bad. I'll just be the first one to admit it. And so I look at friends who serve and protect us, who I know personally, and I know that they get up every day just hoping to come back home. They get up every day to serve and protect. And so I look at it from that standpoint. And so then I also see what from Floyd's standpoint. And I think if you really listen to the families of the people who have lost their loved ones, they would tell a different story than what the media wants you to perceive. They would tell a different story. They would know. Are they upset? Yes. Are they outraged? Absolutely, but not to the point of they want to incite violence into the world. I'm hurting, so someone else needs to hurt. I think if you listen to the story, so people are different. I don't speak for all blacks. Even though myself, I am black.
That's Al Sharpton's job.
That's Al Sharpton's job. I don't speak for all blacks. So there's some things that I have personally gone through. There's some things that I've been blessed with that some people have not been blessed with, but I realize that it's not limited to race. So I grew up in a home where I had both of my parents. My parents, their last, they made 48 years married, 48 years. And they'll tell you, and statistics will say that that's uncommon for a African-American household. Well, not necessarily, because I know plenty of people, African-Americans whose parents stayed together and everything like that. My dad was always working on the road, but he was always home. He was a father to us. He was always home. When he was home, when he wasn't home, we were in church. But when he is home, we were in church. And my dad, he is one of the shining examples of what it means to have a godly father figure in my life. He is that point for me. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that my dad has always taught me was prayer is important, but also family is important, and being there. And so as a kid, I never experienced a time where my dad was not there for us. I remember as a kid growing up playing baseball in the backyard with me and my 3 brothers. My dad was there playing baseball with us, and he was just there. We would go to McDonald's sometimes. He was just there. Well, a generation ahead of me, my dad's generation, his time, his dad and mom weren't together. My dad will tell you to this day, he never once heard his dad say, "I love you." But my dad tells it to all of his kids and grandkids every opportunity he gets. So my dad took what one generation didn't do, and he said, "I'm going to break that curse. I'm going to break that generational curse for him." And so he tells his kids he loves them. So he spends time with his children. My grandfather, what I know of my dad's father, I know they look alike. I know that. I do remember that. And I was young when he passed away, but my grandfather used to come over all the time. He used to come over later on in life. And my dad he tells us a story to this day. He's like, I knew something was up, because when he came to the house on a Sunday, y'all were at church. And there was my spiritual grandmother lived across the street, and she used to take us to church to my home church, what I call my home church. And my dad, he had to work, but he came home that day, and my grandpa waited. He says, "No, I want to wait to see him." And so he sees us, enjoys time with us, then goes home. And that night he has a heart attack. Mm-hmm. And he's placed in a coma, and he never recovered. I remember going to see him in the hospital. And I remember going to his wake and everything like that. But my dad, he grew up his dad not being around, so he grew up early. When he graduated high school, he went into the military. That played a part. Now, that played a huge part in his life as well. Around the time, at the time Vietnam was going on, so he went to the military. I think he was drafted. He'll tell you that. He was like, I was drafted in the military, but he went anyway. Him and my mom got married. My mom got married when she was in high school. I remember my dad. So that my mom was like 16, I believe. But they got married, and my dad went off to the war. I don't know how long he stayed. I really don't. But I do know that played a part. So now that's just my dad's side, where he had to become a man early for him. And he had to make decisions. Do I want to be like this, or do I want to have that life where I don't have that validation of a father who's, I love you, There was no really father figure in his life at that point, so he had to grow up early. Him and his siblings had to grow up early until my grandmother remarried and everything like that, and my grandfather remarried. But my dad was a part of his life, but he wasn't like the influence that my dad has on me. His dad did not have that on my dad. But my dad didn't let that stop him. He allowed that opportunity to be reversed and say, I'm going to love on my kids. I'm going to show them what it means to be a family, what it shows to me to be in a stable house home and everything like that. And so my mom, she never met her dad. She's never met her dad once in her life. You can tell what that's done to her. My mom but I will say this, she never met her dad, but she's had a few stepfathers in her life that were good men to her and her siblings, and my grandmother who, she passed away years ago, but that were a great influence on her. And so and then she had older brothers who loved on who kind of helped raise my mom and everything like that. And so, but you could tell the absence of her father played a particular role in how her life would end up and everything like that. And so, and just to kind of give you an example, my mom is particularly like she grew up where most of her time, I mean, she had stepfathers, but most of her time she did not have that male, she didn't have that male presence other than her brothers and stuff like that. And she grew up in a plantation. She did. She grew up in a plantation. And, not that they weren't slaves or anything. They just grew up on a plantation. And she'll tell you, man, those were some good times and everything like that. We had, they lived in one of the houses and everything like that. And they're like, we lived here and it was good. We drove through. She showed me where she got baptized at and everything as a young child and everything. She would tell me, me and my brothers, me and my brother, we walked to this church like 13 miles every Sunday to this church. We got baptized at this church, and then we went to this church and everything like here. Man, we lived good. We ate good and this and that. And you're hearing great stories. But you tell that to someone in the world today, they'll be like, man, they were oppressed. They were living on a plantation and this and that. These are wrong, stuff like that. So,
how do you... So, like, I think it's... On the one hand, I think it's pretty arrogant to tell somebody, oh, you didn't realize it because you didn't know any better, but you were being severely oppressed.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, let's say somewhere in like Iran where, women can't even drive.
Yeah.
And then you hear kind of their side of the story and like, we don't want to drive.
Yeah,
I don't want to deal with driving. He has to drive me everywhere. I don't care. And so I think it's maybe it's just a cultural thing, but I find this weird kind of balancing, like, when do you realize that somebody's just happy or somebody is maybe, and some people are ignorant, but maybe just a little bit ignorant, and they don't realize that everybody else in the world has moved on from this state.
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes ignorance can be bliss.
That is absolutely true.
And so for me, when my mom was telling me the stories, I got angry. I really got angry. I'm like, you were living on a plantation. Life was good. You probably got you probably got the fatty meat and not the good, healthy meat and everything like that. You probably had to pick cotton and do all. I was so upset. My mind's going all over the place because that's what is being taught. That people that lived on plantations, black people that lived on plantations, that it was this whole oppressive deal and everything like that. And that's just was not the case for my mom. Some of her greatest memories for her was on that plantation. And my mom is 60, I think she's 66, 65, 66, but her memory's so sharp. She remembers the people's names, who the houses that they were, and whose plantation they were living on. She remembers them. She remembers events that happened and everything like that. And she never once, and this is my mom, she never once said an ill thing about these people. She would just say, oh yeah, we used to go and my mom used to help clean this house, and we would do this and we would do that. We would wait for the bus here. Oh, this was some of the best times that we had, and my mom was talking about how because they went through segregation, and then whenever segregation kind of ended and they started, my dad kind of got the end of the beginning of the end of segregation. So his last year, I think they joined the schools together and everything like that. So my mom had a few more years of it and everything like that. My mom got accused of slapping a white teacher, and was put out of school for a whole entire year. And even though people had stepped forward and said, oh no, she didn't do it, she wasn't even a part of that and everything like that, unfortunately, and my mom tells you that the teacher probably didn't really know who did it, and so they were kind of going based off of what people were saying and everything like that. So she had to spend a whole entire year home. That looks different now today. If something like that were to happen today, the kid would go home and they would still get an education, because they would be like, okay, you still got to learn. You're just not going to be learning in school, or you'll go to this alternative school. That wasn't there for them. And so there were some things that unjustly happened for my mom, but she never let that take her down. So the following year, she goes back to school and she bounces back. She's back in school, and I think she even came across that teacher again, and that teacher had no clue who my mom really was and everything like that. And so when it matters to the perspective. So the people who lived it will always tell a different story than the people who just have information. So, different places experience different things. So you have some people where they experienced the Ku Klux Klan burning down houses, killing people. They experienced, I'm talking about black culture, specifically in the United States and in the South. But then on the other hand, you have culture, people who experience nothing but goodness, nothing but great things. And some of these plantation owners actually wanted to be a part of their lives. And I've heard stories of my dad's mom. She's elderly now. She's real elderly, but she's still with us, and she's like in her late 80s. But she was telling me how she used to clean houses for white individuals and everything like that. And she said, you know what? I never had to go to a separate restroom. They told me I could use their restroom. She said, you know what? A white family bought my first car, and it wasn't a used car. It was a brand new car. They said, you know what? If you're gonna come and work for us, we want you to have the best transportation. So they bought her a brand new car, and that was for her and her family and everything like that. So different people have different experiences and everything like that. So,
well, I think that kind of goes back to having grace on people by the times that they lived in, because of the generalization of what was normal at the time.
Absolutely.
And look, it's a bitter pill, even for me personally, to swallow. But there's probably going to be, I don't want technical sins through the eyes of people who don't share my worldview in generations from now, that I'm like, well, I didn't know that was wrong. That we're living by completely different standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even like, look, man, whenever I was in first grade, I said the word stupid, and my classmates gasped. And because I was homeschooled, in kindergarten and pre-kinder, and whenever I was in first grade, I said the word stupid, and everybody gasped, and I was like a pariah. And 2 years later, in third grade, I was getting a bus ride home, and I saw a first grader flicking off another kid as he was getting off the bus. Like, he was flicking off a kid that was in the bus, and I was like, What? How did in just 2 years it went from, everybody thinking it was horrible that I said the word stupid to like I dropped an F-bomb or something all the way to it's normal for these young kids to be flicking each other off. What happened in the past 2 years that made that normal?
Man, that's crazy. It's funny. Kind of a weird incident that happened to me many years ago. I was in Walmart, and like you said, times have changed. I'm in Walmart, and this little girl has her hand stuck in like the little 25-cent dispenser, like you get a little prize and everything like that. And so I'm sitting there, and people are helping her and everything, and she looks at me, and she's like, "What the blank are you looking?" I'm like, she's like, got to be 4 or 5, or maybe younger than that. And I'm just sitting there like, wow. And she's cussing everybody who's even around, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm like, the mom is just sitting there, and she had this look of like, there's nothing I can do, and so I'm sitting there like, we've thrown around this phrase, what one generation takes in moderation, another will take in excess, and I don't know if that always applies to everything, but I will say 100% certainty that it, based on your experience, the outcome will be different. So I wished, and I wish everyone could grow up in a household where 2 parents that love them, a mom and a dad who can give them their experience, but at the same time pass along the idea of, when you make your own experience, learn from what we've done probably wrong in some areas and be better at it and everything like that. And like, I wish my dad had developed this mindset when we were younger. He doesn't really like spanking his grandchildren. I wish we had that. My mom especially, she lived by the belt. And my dad traveled most of the time. I mean, F on the report card, that was a whipping. Talking back, that was a whipping. And I'll never forget, I got my first backhand from my mom whenever I was a grown man. I was like in my 20s, a particular situation, and my mom backhanded me, but it stopped me in my tracks and helped me. And now looking back at that situation, like, man, I could have been, and it happened to be surrounded around it could have been a George Floyd situation. Could have been, it had to do with the police officers and everything like that, and some things that was happening. But when she stopped me in my tracks, because I'm just sitting there like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. Thank you. Now I'm like, thank you. Like that, you preserved my life. Things could have gotten worse. But I really, really firmly believe that it's kind of like a person with an experience is never at the mercy of someone with just information and knowledge. And so I think for us to grow and us to learn, we have to take those situations where we have to learn that there are racial things happening in the world back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. Yes. Are those same things happening today? Yes, but they're not happening just to a certain ethnic group. They're happening to everyone. Racism has life when you give it life. But how do you take someone? So here's the age of, how do you take someone who has these taboos that probably grew up, like we were kind of talking about, hinted at. So I grew up in a family where it's all blacks. And how do you take that from, a white person comes over to visit and you don't treat them? How do you treat them? Do you treat them like you would treat a normal black person? Or how do you go from, or let's say even dealing with an issue where for a fact someone is racist towards skin color and everything like that? How do you approach that situation as someone who is trying to be a part of the solution and be better at everything like that? I think is get to know their experience. Get to know, if they'll allow you to, get to know their experience. Most people had a bad experience for some reason, and then you have to have grace enough, and I'm not talking just on a spiritual standpoint, but on a ethical and a moral standpoint. Even if you just had a worldly world view and a moral standpoint, on that standpoint, you have to have grace with a person's experience.
That's hard. That's hard. I think it's kind of hard to separate those two things out, because I think, in my estimation, grace is something pretty unique to a Christian worldview.
Right.
And whereas it seems like in every other one that, it is wholly eye for an eye.
Yeah.
Kind of stamp. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's good. That's really, really good. It's so true. And so you have to counter culture. You have to counter culture. And the way you counter culture is you learn from others' experience and you provide grace, and you say, listen, if you're willing to bridge this gap one person at a time, one experience at a time, let's take the experience you've had by creating a new experience of something better, of us dialoguing together, us getting to know each one another and everything like that. Then we can take that and take it to another circle. So our biggest influence some of us will have big platforms and everything like that, and we'll be able to have our own jerseys and sit out games and everything like that. But right now, the biggest influence anybody ever has is within your personal circle. And so, if you would preach, I say preach. Let me stop using spiritual terminology. If you would be willing to be a bridge of equality in your personal circle, and you're constantly being that bridge where it's okay to to have differences and be at my table. It's okay for us to not have the same viewpoint on certain things. But one thing we have in common is the right to live. One thing we have in common is our the right to be human, and the right to be to live in a world where that matters. Your life matters. Your life matters. If you're constantly willing to be that bridge, your circle will continually grow, because that someone in your circle has their own circle. And that person has their circle, and so you see these rings of circles going around in the world, and if your influence is, so I use for example the two that I married today. The two that I married a few months ago, that were one was from my very first youth group, and the other one was kind of from my very last youth group prior to helping out at the church now that I'm at. Two different individuals. One's white, one's black. I knew that would happen because the influence that I had on that young man when they were young. The young man that I married, his sister, it's kind of cool. His sister's dating a black guy. He has family members in his family that are that have expressed racial issues. But like I told them, I said, you guys are the bridge. You guys truly are the bridge to a better way of expressing love and expressing equality. And I said, that's when I got that release and that peace, because I sat back and I'm like, man, there is absolutely, and I'm not tooting my own horn here, but there was no other way those two would have met. There's no other way. Had I not gone to Channel View, had I not gone back to my home church, had I not said I would go back and help out those two would have never met. And you could just tell it was destiny's hand on the wall for those two. It's like, man, wow. They're married now. You could tell that they're going to attack this world by storm to do some great things together. I think in the local church and beyond, they just they come from different backgrounds. They come from different cultures, but they have a love in common. They have They have that in common. They have a purpose in common and everything like that. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I can honestly say that when you're constantly being a bridge in your own circle, you will experience things that will no longer be the things that seem uncommon, like this black individual is marrying a white individual. You won't have that sense of, that's weird. You're going to have that sense of, wow.
Well, so like, how do you feel about the idea of attributing meaning to the color of your own or somebody else's skin? Because I know that there's a big push against, so people want you to some people want you to feel a certain way about race, but at the same time, they don't want you to be colorblind. And like for me personally, I really couldn't care less. I think it's probably the most meaningless thing about somebody is how much pigment they have. But there is, and I guess it's the dichotomy between being a humanist, which is kind of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was, and then being anti-racist, which is what you could attribute Malcolm X.
Excellent, yeah.
You know, that kind of dichotomy has been going on since Du Bois and oh my goodness, what's his name? Du Bois and I can't remember his name. But and I guess we can kind of wrap up on this is, what's your take on that? Whenever somebody tries to imbue the color of their skin with meaning.
So I brought back to a sermon that I preached a while back. So that's a good point. And the title of that sermon was The God Option. I got that viewpoint from a pastor, Pastor Miles McPherson. He's the senior pastor of Rock Church in San Diego, California. And he writes this book called The Third Option. And the third option is, I will say that, this is not me. I'm not getting paid for that or anything like that. But that book really changed my perspective on how to view things. Even for me, how do I relate to my fellow, my fellow man? I'm going to say it like that. Because I don't like to give life to racism at all. So how do I relate to my fellow man who happens to be the same race as me? So the God option, it talks about how we're living in a time where there's so much division going on around us that we have to understand that the world paints racism as us versus them, white versus black, Democrat versus Republican, gay versus straight, Christian versus atheist, and the list could go on. Right now, I'm just reading this kind of off of this. Right now, we're watching, as we watch the news, the narrative is white versus black, cops versus black culture, a decisive narrative of us versus them. But when we get down to it, there's one thing we fail to see because it wasn't made obvious to us, but it should have been made obvious to us, is that we have one thing in common. And that one thing in common is that we're all human. That we're all human. And that should unite us. I wanted to kind of give just an example of what it means to speak life into your neighbor. Jesus tells the story of a man who happens to get beaten by bandits and thrown off onto the side of the road. And he says 3 distinguished people passed this individual. A priest, a Levite, and then eventually the Samaritan. So the priest comes back and looks at this individual and says, I can't, I got to keep going. The Levite comes and says, no, I can't associate with this, and keeps going. And then you have the Samaritan who sees this man who's from Samaritans had a different belief system than the Jews did. So he picks him up, puts him on his own donkey, his own horse or camel, brings him to this inn. He takes care of him, and then he's got to go on his way. He's got to go about his life. And he's like, I want to leave this money here. I'm going away, and I'll be back. And if he accumulates any other debt, I'll come and settle this whenever I get back. Just look after him. And Jesus tells the story. So who was the neighbor to the man beaten by bandits? And so the religious people at the time says, well, it was the one who showed mercy on him. He says, good, go and do likewise. So the God option is that is the God option. We go and do likewise. No matter who is our neighbor is everyone. Our neighbor doesn't always look like us, and we have to stand with that common ground of knowing that, hey, these are the who is our neighbor? Our neighbor is our brothers who kneel before on a field. Our neighbors are those who riot. Our neighbor are those in blue. Our neighbor are the people in the LGBTQ. The people at our job are our neighbor. The people we pass under the bridge. I work downtown, so I see people under the bridge all the time, begging for money. After that argument, we have to understand that our neighbor are those people. And so, this is something that God placed on my heart, and I had 3 points. I'm just going to actually say the points, and I'm not going to.
I'm gonna have you back on so we can get a little bit deeper into this stuff.
So the 2 points that I had that I had was, you can't reach who you push away. You can't reach who you push away. Then the other one was, honor what you have in common. Acknowledge that you have blind spots. We all have blind spots. There are some things. Okay, these guys are kneeling on the court. These guys are kneeling on the football field. As a patriot, it makes me angry that they're kneeling during the national anthem and this and that. And I understand that. Don't put that to the side. We have blind spots. We all have blind spots. We have to acknowledge that. And a part of the God option is that, how many times have you passed up your neighbor because of skin or because of certain things? So I know, and I'm just using this as an example to kind of close out. When I go visit, and I'll probably be there this weekend, when I go visit my grandmother, she lives in the worst neighborhood in her city. Literally, somebody gets murdered in that project behind her house almost every other weekend. I don't like being over there. It's a predominantly black neighborhood. I have blind spots even to my own race, because there's some good people that live in that project, but yet I associate all of them with the knuckleheads, and I shouldn't do that. And I have to realize that when I put my neighbor in the same category as someone who I don't want to associate with, I no longer become a bridge. I now become a dam. Keep us separate. It's me versus you. And that's not what we don't have. That's something that should not be there. And so I feel like the God option, we have to start choosing the third option, and that is, what do we have in common, and let's go from there. Well, we have the right to live. We're humans. We have that in common. Let's start from there. Okay, well, what are your experiences? Well, I've been through this. Okay, well, this is my experience. Okay, where can we learn from our experience and move forward and create better experiences and everything like that? And that's why, and I say this, we will come to a point in our lives where we'll hear of certain things like, well, that person, don't fool around with him, and that person's racist. And your experience with that person may be different. Like, man, are you sure? Especially if you're talking with someone of the same.
And it becomes so like confusing because it's like, oh, maybe they just don't like you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they just like me. Maybe they like me, or maybe they don't like all black people, but maybe they just like, or any number of conversations. And I think it has to do a lot with. So I made a post on Facebook, I think a couple of years ago, maybe last year, but it was talking about how it was going. I listed a few different stories. One of them was Beauty and the Beast, and I think they're Disney movies, but they were like based in like very classic stories. And
right.
It was like, okay, well back then, this is the value that could be extracted from that story,
Right.
And then nowadays, this is what's extracted from the story. And basically, it's just like the difference, like depending on what lens you're wearing, like, are you looking for fundamental truths, or are you looking through your own lens at a particular thing?
That's good.
And I feel like that really just is really impactful. There was I don't know who he was, but there was a video I was watching on Facebook of a gentleman, a black gentleman from the UK, and he was highly intelligent, and he went to a very prestigious university. And he was talking about his race experiences, and one of them was that he was saying that even his teachers knew that he was going to deal with some things, so his teachers were telling him like how to deal with these things. And I was like, maybe his teachers knew that because of the color of his skin, he was going to be dealing with some things. I think also maybe that his teachers, because of the color of his skin, gave him a lens on how to view certain experiences that he may have.
Right.
And so I think there's this balance that you need to have. Like, am I viewing this through a heavily biased lens, or am I searching for the fundamental, even metaphysical truth
It's good.
that you might have? And it's, and one of the things that I say a lot is that things are typically more complicated than people give them credit for.
Wow. Good.
Because people themselves are very complicated, and we like to distill people into the images that we see based upon our limited experiences.
Yeah.
And through conversation, then you can start getting into the nuances of experiences.
Yeah, it's good.
And it's just... It's complicated.
It's complicated. And I think that is where we have to start. It is complicated, but it is not unobtainable.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite movies to kind of put in perspective of certain things is the Bruce Almighty series. And I'm talking more about the Evan Almighty.
Yeah.
But God was like, Morgan Freeman, he had that. It's kind of cool. I think that if God had that, that persona, that would be kind of cool. But he says in there, he's like that you assumed one thing when I told you to build an ark.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that ark really meant a random act of kindness, So he was sitting there like, wow. I think that's how and he kind of also dialogues with his wife and says, when you ask for patience, does God just patience, or does he give you opportunities to be patient?
I really like that scene.
Yeah.
I think that scene was theologically sound. Surprisingly, from a Hollywood movie, I think that scene was theologically sound.
Absolutely. And that's where we are today. Are we going to... Let's look deeper into what it means to be a neighbor. So one of the, and I'll just, and I kind of guess end with this. I don't know if you've heard this slogan. I say it is a slogan, but it's coming from scripture as well as kind of paraphrased. But many churches have adopted this this motto, and these churches that have adopted this motto that actually live it. I can tell you right now, because I used to love on Saturday nights churches who had. I say now churches that have started having these Saturday services, you could see the difference in their hearts. So the motto is love God, love people, change the world. Love God, love people, change the world. those churches that live it, and I'm talking this from a church standpoint, you can see it in their congregation. You can see it in their congregation. It is diverse. It is culturally diverse, ethnically diverse, and generationally diverse. That's the church. That is the true church when we are that type of diversity. In churches that you don't see that, something is missing. Something, that's a whole nother story, but something truly is missing. And it is up to leaders to create diversity. And the best way to create diversity is to show through your relationships diversity. So I said I made a post a few months back about, I challenged pastors of who have an all white staff to start hiring people on their staff that were ethnically different in appearance. So white pastors hire black pastors, hire Hispanic pastors, hire Asian pastors. You'll see the diversity. A diverse team will produce a diverse church. And so I even challenge black churches. There are some churches that are predominantly black. If they would hire someone of a different ethnic background, they'll start seeing diversity, and that will bridge so many more gaps in the church itself. Because we talk about racial issues on a moral standpoint in the world, but there are so many racial issues happening in our local churches. Some of our churches stay in the position that they are in, and I'm not talking. And so when we say a small church, I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about in the mindset. A small church in the mindset is generally a church that does not see the taboos, that does not feel like they have blind spots. There's some churches out here today, just I'm going to be honest with you. Let's say I'm going to take my home church for an example. I love them. I really, really love them. Now you might see a difference. You might now. But growing up in my church, if my lead pastor, if he would have moved away earlier, in which he did in some cases, that church that I grew up in would have never, ever considered a black candidate as the pastor, a Hispanic candidate as the pastor. That's just was not in the DNA of that church, and it caused that church to stifle in growth. And I'm not talking numbers. I'm talking mentally. So when I took over that youth ministry, there was nobody coming. It's kind of like a Kevin Martin experience. No one was coming really at that time. But I took experiences that I had at other youth groups. Like, so in Channelview, most of my students were Hispanic, and I had a few, different diversity and everything like that. But my diversity didn't come until the leadership that I had surrounding around me, team leadership. They were all of different backgrounds, different. I mean, you had guys that were skaters, you had guys who were in the heavy metal and everything like that. And you know what? I would go to heavy metal shows. Because I wanted to show them that I support them. And these are Christian heavy metal, guys and everything like that. So I took that and we produced together. God allowed us the grace to produce a diverse youth ministry. But at Trinity, at the church that my home church, we went from 0 until our last service. We were running close to 120 students. And that was a multi-ethnic youth ministry. It was a multicultural youth ministry, and even to in a sense, it was a multi-generational youth ministry. All three of those phases produced diversity there. So racism was never an issue for us as a youth ministry, because we were all one family. the problem why that ended, and I'll say this as my ending. I keep saying that I must be a minister. The reason why that came to an end is because that was not a reflection of what the church looked like. And because it was not a reflection of what the church looked like, it came to an end. And that's something you want to unpack. We can unpack it, but that might be for another
Next
time.
time.
But so I say this is build bridges, not dams.
Yeah.
So that's the only way we're going to see what it really means to stop putting race or giving life to racism as a whole. So, and that's where I'm at on that point.
All right, man. We'll end right there.
All righty.
Yeah, I want to have you back.
I
Take it
appreciate
easy,
it.
man.
Looking forward to it.